What you are doing makes sense. I'm Dr. Carol. Thank you for joining me on this episode. The ways you react to things, people, circumstances, triggers, the kinds of strategies you have developed to make it in the world, all of that makes sense. You didn't wake up one day and decide to have issues. Things were part of your life that led you to develop the strategies that have worked for you. They helped you survive and get to wherever you are in life now. But is that where you want to stay? Many of us, myself included, come through our early life not with all the tools or strategies or healthy ways of relating that really would lead to a life of thriving. I, as many people have, came into early life with an insecure attachment, but that can change. Being securely attached to people, and most importantly to God, makes so much possible. So much goodness and, frankly, productivity and generativity in the sense of bringing goodness to the world comes when you have a foundation of being securely attached. How do you get there? How do you move from the junk to the goodness? The process of spiritual formation. That's really what we're talking about. This is the second of two conversations with two couples about spiritual formation. If you didn't listen to our previous podcast episode, that was with a couple talking about their process of spiritual formation, Bill and Christy Gaultier. Today, I have another delightful couple to bring to you, Cyd and Geoff Holsclaw. They are co-directors of the Doctor of Ministry program in spiritual formation and relational neuroscience at Western Theological Seminary. They have written some books, including their most recent one, Landscapes of the Soul: How the Science and Spirituality of Attachment Can Move You into Confident Faith, Courage, and Connection. Spiritual directors, professors, many decades of helping people, and you will find this conversation incredibly enriching. I often say this was this was really one of my favorite conversations this year. I am just thrilled to bring Cyd and Geoff Holsclaw to you. Well, Geoff and Cyd Holsclaw, we were talking for just a moment off camera before we clicked record, and I'm already just so excited. We are going to have some wonderful stuff to talk about today. First of all, just welcome to you both. It's great to have you guys here.
Thank you. It's good to be here, and I'm already excited. Your excitement is contagious, so I'm looking forward to this.
I agree.
Yeah. I knew when God started bringing me out of my own mess as a young woman that my attachment was insecure. As soon as that language started to be known in, parlance out there, I knew it had been insecure. But as I read through the book that the two of you have recently released, I gained another level of understanding and appreciation even for my own story. And I am just thrilled about how the two of you are bringing some of this understanding and language to spiritual formation, becoming who Jesus designed us to be. So maybe I can just start with each of you taking a moment, the background of how you even came to be interested in neurobiology, neuroscience, and spiritual formation, bringing those things together.
Well, I'll start this time. Sometimes Cyd always starts, but I think, so for the spiritual formation side, I remember very clearly when I was in college, there was a moment where God said during some prayer time, I remember I was in my apartment, something to the effect of, you know me as Savior, but you don't know me as Father. And that was probably when I was 19, maybe 20 or 21. And I didn't even know what that meant outside of like some basic understanding of the Trinity. And that really kind of set me on a journey. And then when I started having, when we got married and I started having children, I started the kind of understanding that there was all sorts of gaps in my own relationship with my father, and kind of understanding kind of this deeper yearnings, I think, that God was always trying to fulfill. And, then they're part of the story fits with Cyd's, and just kind of understanding and learning about trauma. And we just kind of kept working our way. And so kind of the experience and a deeper understanding of who God was kind of forming. And then the attachment language really kind of came much later after some of that maybe trauma or some of the neuroscience kind of language. But that just, for me, because I'm much more of a researcher, I'm a heady kind of person, I was just like, it just gave language to not just my own experiences or the experiences maybe with Cyd and, but really kind of like the gospel story really fits this kind of God desiring to reattach us in a secure way when we're wounded by sin. And so as a theologian and professor, I was just like, oh, this is the gospel story. And so it was just so exciting to really dive into the literature in that way.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah. And I came to it from, I had some early trauma in my life. I lost my dad when I was 15 months old in a car accident. And I was in the car. And so that was, my early years were spent with my mom really sort of muscling her way through and doing what needed to be done while also experiencing this deep grief. So that definitely influenced my early years and my attachment with my mom. And then, she got remarried when I was 6, and he had never been a parent before and didn't really understand children. And so there was a lot of difficulty in that relationship, which of course also impacted my attachment.
Yeah.
And then, I just sort of had a lot of really unhealthy, poor relationships, especially with men in my high school and college years. And sort of reached this breaking point of like, what is wrong with me? I keep, it's sort of like that classic Romans 6. I do the things I don't want to do. The things I do, it's just a mess. And sort of that, why can't I made all these great intentions to change? I always kind of wanted to do things a little differently. But at the same time, I had this sort of perspective of God that, I was I come from Dutch immigrants. We had this sort of stoic, God helps those who help themselves. So do what you need to do. And, God will take care of the bigger picture, but your little picture is all you. And so I experienced a lot of shame and a lot of what is wrong with me? Why am I making such a disaster of my life? And then it wasn't until somehow Geoff hung in there with me. And then right before we got married, then my mom died very suddenly too. And we were already, committed to each other, already engaged. So we went and followed through on our marriage, and then everything fell apart because all of my attachment, strategies were coming forward, even though I couldn't call them attachment strategies yet.
Yeah.
And also I think all of my trauma had been re-triggered by losing my mom very suddenly like that. And so it was when someone sort of introduced me to Emmanuel approach and the writings of Dr. Carl Lehman. He wrote this book called Outsmarting Yourself, Catching Your Past, Invading Your Present, and What to Do About It. And the title alone made me go, oh, is my past invading my present? Is that my problem? And as I started reading that and learning, this was before Bessel van der Kolk wrote The Body Keeps the Score. And so this was all new to me. But this understanding of how our brains and bodies process experiences and how those processing experiences, those pathways can be interrupted by trauma,
Yes.
Especially if we feel alone and we don't have someone who we can be with and someone who we can process with. And so as I started learning all of this, I started sort of understanding, what? Some of these things that I do make a lot of sense. Like, I don't like that I do them, but man, I understand why I do them.
Yes.
And that was a huge shift in my self-compassion. And that self-compassion opened the door then for me to receive the compassion of Jesus as well. Of that, you make sense to me. I understand why you do the things you do, and look at what you've experienced, and, you're still here. And Jesus meeting me right where I was and sort of gently leading me deeper and further into trusting him, into learning to trust Geoff and learning to trust relationships in general, because I really struggled to trust being close to people because of that fear of losing someone suddenly. And so that was then when Geoff introduced me. Geoff is actually the one who started saying, I've been reading this attachment literature. I think this might be helpful to you. And when I first started, so I'm the one that brought him into the interpersonal neurobiology, and he brought me into the attachment literature. And when I started reading about attachment, I was just so filled with discouragement because everything I was reading was basically like, this is the way you are and too bad for you. You're insecure. You've got all these problems. But I didn't see a lot of hope. And, they weren't being written from a Christian perspective. Most of them were from a secular understanding. And so there just wasn't a lot of hope in it. It was just sort of like, here's what the people around you need to understand about you. But there wasn't a lot of, here's how you can actually be transformed and build a secure attachment.
You have alluded to something that I have become passionate about. I went to medical school like 35 years ago, and I was taught, as everybody was in those days, that by the time you're maybe 25-ish years old, your brain is pretty much done. It's the way it's going to be. And there's nothing significant that changes later after that. And as neuroscience has learned in the last few decades about neuroplasticity and that our brains can change, even though it may be slower and more challenging when you're an adult, our brains can change. And I think that is so exciting, especially for us as followers of Jesus, because I think that is the message of the gospel.
Yes.
As you alluded to, Geoff. As we start talking about some of this attachment language and what that means for our relationship with Jesus, our listeners may have heard something about insecure and secure attachment and the various parts of that, but maybe let's set the foundation with what the basic categories of attachment are and what that means. We've kind of been assuming as we've used that language, but just a brief foundation there of what we're talking about.
Well,
you go ahead.
We both want to talk at the same time. The foundation, first of all, basically what we mean when we say attachment theory is that, because we're not born with fully formed nervous systems, we're talking about how your early caregiving relationships really impact the way that your nervous system develops, what you consider to be safe and what you consider to be unsafe, and sort of the things that you notice and don't notice, the things that you're really attending to. That's highly impacted by the care environment that you grew up in. And so, attachment is designed by God to help us to develop and mature and grow into this sense of, I am close with my people, but I also have what it takes to go out in the world and to explore and sort of do things on my own. And so that's really what God's intention is. And then, of course, to model and mirror what God's, perfect attachment for us is. But the sadness is that most of us, a lot of us don't grow up with that feeling of I am seen and known and I'm given care, but I'm also given courage to go out into the world. The way we talk about that is intimacy and independence. Like throughout your childhood, you're developing this capacity to be close with others in intimacy, but you're also developing this capacity to go off and explore. Like a kid who's first learning to walk will wander further and further away from the parent, knowing that when they fall, they can either look back and see that they're okay, or the parent will come and scoop them up. And so that sense of stretching the boundaries is that capacity for independence. And, we're meant to have them in equal measure and for those to be integrated. And that's what we would call a secure attachment. And that's that understanding of, I can be both very close to people and very independent of people. And those things work together. They're both good. And so that's really what secure attachment would be. And then the other landscapes that we talk about are, you're either prioritizing intimacy at the expense of your own independence, where you're not feeling like you have a lot of ability to explore the world or to go out and do things on your own, or you're prioritizing independence at the expense of intimacy and you're highly capable and independent, but you have struggled to connect with others. Or if you find yourself in what's called a disorganized attachment, or we like to call it conflicted attachment, where you would find yourself in more of a war zone. If it's a struggle to feel close to people and to be connected in that way, and it's also a struggle to believe that you have what it takes to act independently. And so you're sort of confused and conflicted in those priorities a bit, in those capacities, for good reason.
Yes.
Because a lot of times as you were growing up, you had to be close and move toward people that you knew would hurt you or that you would experience pain in that relationship. And it's incredibly confusing. And it's incredible that you're, if you're one of those people, as you listen to this, you're here and you've survived.
Yes.
And those strategies that you have are what carried you through. And so we can have a lot of compassion and, even praise God for that capacity to be able to continue to survive. And then also strategies. We like using that language because strategies can be changed. Mm-hmm. It's not a style. It's not a personality. It's a strategy. And there's survival strategies. And once you're through that period of needing to survive, you can shift your strategies into more of a, how do I thrive rather than just survive?
Love that. And the language you just used was part of what, in reading the book, helped put some things in place in even my own story, my own soul. But how does all that then impact our connection with God? Maybe Geoff, the theological side of this, what does those basic neural pathways that get built into us when we're kids, truthfully, how does that impact the way we see God and our connection with Him?
Yeah, well, so that's kind of the research has been trying to figure out exactly how it works for a little while. And so there are these two words. One is compensation and the other one is correlation. I know those are kind of big, fancy words. But so when the attachment research started, is they said, well, people have like an insecure attachment, whether it's the jungle or the war zone or the desert, and they're trying to compensate for the lack of their relationships by reaching out to God, by turning to God. All right. And you see this all the time in scripture. You read Psalms, like, the idea of a God-shaped hole in your heart, right? So like we have this awareness that like, yeah, there's something's missing and God fills that in. So he compensates. So the literature uses the word for compensate for that loss. And so in one sense, that's the positive movement into the pasture, the secure attachment. We call it the pasture. But then the literature also kind of had conflicting research data that came forward and it said, well, on the explicit level, like our verbal kind of conscious level, we do turn to God, or we say that we trust God. We say that we think God's available to us when we're in distress and that God loves us. But then they do very complicated kind of experiments and things. But they found out that actually more often than not, our view of God corresponds to our disordered attachment or to our insecure attachment. And so even though our brains, if we want to use the head and heart language, our heads would say, some true facts about who God is, but our hearts actually still believed that God was like a jungle God, that God was kind of coming and going at will, and I had to capture his attention. And does God really like me? We wrote a whole book about that. Or maybe a different kind of person with a different upbringing has a desert kind of view of God, which is, well, God is the cosmic ruler who sits behind his big desk and rules the world and doesn't really care about me. And I kind of like it that way because, I don't really want to be near, I'm not really great with intimate relationships. So the idea of God as a cosmic ruler is great, but the idea of God as a friend or a lover, like, oh, that's weird. Right. And so they found that more often than not, deep down, we actually make God in our own image. And what does that mean? We make God into our own attachment image, our own attachment strategy. We like to, so we say in the book that God's drawing us into the good pasture, but more often than not, we're dragging God into our insecure attachment strategies. And so that's kind of the whole journey of salvation, the journey of sanctification is actually surrendering those views of God that we've created in our own image, our own attachment strategy image, and learning who God really is like as we journey toward the pasture.
Yeah. I have worked with many, many people who are exactly as you describe, Geoff. Intellectually, another way I would say it is left brain wise, that conscious knowing, they believe what's true about God and they would say, God loves me. But their right brain or their emotional self or their heart or the other part of them doesn't feel that. There's a big disconnect there. And That's why I love the two of you talking about attachment in this way, because it's not only our relationship with people, which really, really matters, but this gets into our salvation in the sense of connection with God, the whole human project that he has, here on earth. There's a concept that the two of you talk about, and that is bringing Jesus into the memories from our past. Cyd, you referenced The Body Keep the Score, Van der Kolk's book, and whether it's big T trauma or little t trauma, whether it's single events or just the way of life that got you to unconsciously or subconsciously perhaps believe what you believe about the world and God, bringing Jesus into those memories. I'd love to hear you guys talk for a minute about that.
Well, the way that trauma, the different circumstances can become trauma or not, just depending on your experience of it, right? So if you are companioned by someone who is attuned to you in the midst of that, and you feel this sense of someone is glad to be with me, then it's less likely that it's going to be stored as trauma in your body. However, if you're by yourself and there's no one who's sort of noticing what it's doing to you and nobody who's really recognizing the impact of it, it's a lot more likely to become something that is traumatic, where your brain hasn't finished processing it. And it's sort of like you keep trying to finish it. And then that's what gets, stirred back up all the time. And so the approach that, and I'm getting this all from Dr. Carl Lehman, who is the one who first developed this Emmanuel approach. And what he found is he had done the approach of trying to bring Jesus into the places of pain. But what he discovered was if you are really, really intentional about establishing the gladness to be with Jesus, and then asking Jesus, where do you want to take me? Or where does this seem to take root? Or where does this start in my life? Then it's like you're going with the one who's glad to be with you. So you're never alone. Otherwise, if you're going back to the painful memory and then saying, Jesus, where are you? Oftentimes people can't find Jesus in that memory. And then that makes it even more traumatic. And that's because our bodies have this dual priority of we're either connecting with others or we're protecting ourselves. And so if you're going into a place of danger, you're going to flip into that protection mode of what do I need to do to protect myself and how do I need to survive here? Whereas if you're going with a connection with Jesus, then you're moving into those spaces that Jesus is going into with you while in a place of connection, borrowing his capacity, borrowing his understanding of the story, borrowing everything that is, that he has to offer you rather than being stuck on your own. And so when you go back into a memory that might be, traumatic for you, you're no longer alone. You're with someone who's attuned to you, someone who's glad to be with you. And sort of like you're retelling the story. It's changing the way that it's stored in your brain forever forward. And I personally have experienced this around a lot of the traumas in my life where, patiently and tenderly over time, Jesus has eventually led me back into some of these places of pain, but he's with me. And that makes all the difference in the world, because then I don't have to be terrified because I'm not alone and unseen and misunderstood, but instead I can make sense of it because he's making sense of it for me.
Mm. That just thrills my soul. And I believe that is where a lot of my own healing came. I would classify my coming to adulthood as out of the war zone, very disorganized. And some of the anxiety, the anxious side of attachment, the jungle, and some of the avoidant, the desert side, as you describe it, style of attachment. I identified with both of those. And as the two of you described, okay, what's the disorganized or confusing or complicated or war zone type of just the paradigm in which my brain dealt with the world, that just made so much sense in my own story. One of the things that you do beautifully in the book is talk about this isn't looking at how you came to be whatever attachment style you have with condemnation or contempt. This is the way you responded to the difficult circumstances often in your life. And so there's no negative shame or whatever about coming to be that way, but it doesn't have to stay that way. And you are so gentle, especially for those who might find themselves in the war zone, in encouraging them. It may feel difficult, but you can move forward into, with your language, the pasture. And I want to verify that in my own story. I can look back now and choose to remember some of the things that happened that got my internal processing that to be that way. But that's not the way it is now. I can live in honest joy. My husband passed away a few years ago, and although it was excruciatingly painful to go through that grief, I didn't fall into a bunch of dysfunction. I had my attachment secure, both with people and with God, so I could walk through that difficult thing. Now, I live my days with joy and goodness, even through hard things. So I just want to, for people that may find themselves in some of these difficult places, to just say, I believe I've been there, done that, and moving forward is possible. And I'd love to hear from the two of you a bit more about what are some ways that moving forward is possible out of these hard ways of relating to the world.
Well, I'll just say the thing that I feel like a broken record around, and then Geoff can add some other things. But for me, I think the very first step is that compassion of the understanding of, I don't have to beat myself up because of these things that I do. I can understand that they make sense. And that's the first place, because if you're constantly, upset with yourself, then you're flipping yourself into that protection mode all the time. But moving toward yourself with compassion of like, this is it makes sense that I developed these strategies. There's actually some gifts in those strategies. People who find themselves with that kind of jungle strategy of attachment are incredibly tuned to the social and emotional landscape. You can read people. You have incredible empathy skills. You're so good at being able to understand where people are at. And, on the other side, if you find yourself in sort of a desert strategy, you have these incredible skills of being able to think in big picture, thinking logical, linear about things, and sort of discovering patterns in the world. And those are great gifts and great skills. And, we try to really unpack that in the book too, to help you see that even though these strategies were born out of a necessity to survive, you also have these incredible gifts that you developed in these strategies that you don't need to throw away and discard, but you can actually reclaim them as the gifts that they are. And then have compassion for the places where you feel like you get thwarted and you get stuck, because they still make sense. And so that compassion of, I see why I do this, and I understand it, and it makes sense to me. And I'm going to stop getting so upset with myself about it. And instead, I'm going to say, it makes sense. Now, Jesus, how do you want to meet me here? And how do you want to move me into the pasture with you?
That's good.
Yeah. I would add, on top of that, then, the next step would be to start cultivating joy. And that does all sorts of really positive kind of neurological work. You're literally retraining your brain. But sometimes joy can feel like too, depending on who you are, your life experience, and maybe traumas, joy just seems like it's too far away, right? So just having more things like gratitude, thankfulness, any kind of gratitude journal or practice, or maybe just something that's even as basic as this moment right now, I'm thankful for the room that I'm in, or that I can read books later, whatever your favorite thing is, right? And sometimes the gratitude then just starts with kind of being more embodied. And so that'd be another one, is just how do we practice gratitude as we build up toward that joy? And then after that is, you kind of need to gather new data, is the way Cyd and I talk about it. And so if you want to develop a secure attachment with God spiritually, then you need to kind of, obviously Jesus says we become childlike. Now, what do children do is they're like little scientists who are gathering data. They're running experiments about how the world works. And they're playing, they're doing things on their own. They're calling out for help, right? They're making jokes or whatever, right? They're doing all sorts of things to gather data from these experiments. And really what they're coming up with is models for intimacy and models for independence, like we've been talking about. And so, well, how does the journey of faith then change those? How do we update kind of our working models of the world? Well, we have to run new experiments. So we talk about throughout the book that faith really is kind of running new experiments. Is I'm going to try something new because I want to trust God. And so I have to run new intimacy experiments where I'm going to trust God with my life, or I'm going to trust others. I'm going to be vulnerable. I'm going to try to learn and articulate what my emotions are. But I'm also going to run experiments of independence, which is and sometimes depending on the churches, cultures you're from, like that's just called obedience, right? What are the clear things that God has called me into that I need to start doing, and that I have the agency and the responsibility? I need to flex and kind of exercise that agency, that independence muscle. And then when it comes to the jungle and the desert and the war zone a little bit, but you're kind of already lopsided. So the jungle person probably has strong intimacy muscles, and that's good. And we want to honor that. So then your work is really to kind of stretch those independence muscles, which is regardless of how I feel in the moment toward whoever's in front of me, or even towards God, or regardless of how I feel God feels about me, I'm going to believe that his word is true, and I'm going to take the next faithful step. And I'm going to keep going. But people who are in the desert, like their independency, like their obedience muscles, sometimes really strong. And so they actually need to work out their intimacy, which is, maybe to be honest with God about their negative emotions, or sharing that with other people, safe friends, or spouse, or something like that, where they can just be like, actually, I was really upset today, or I was sad today that this happened. And then kind of write a prayer or something to God, just expressing that, not trying to fix it, but just kind of putting your heart, your emotions out there. So we just kind of have to run new experiments and exercise those two muscles, and slowly and surely the good shepherd will lead us into the good pasture.
That's good. That's really good. In coming to have a stronger connection with Jesus, one of the things that occurs to me is as my sense of security with Jesus grows, then the sense of me being able to go out into the world like a toddler learning to walk, it strengthens my independence, so to speak. I am functioning with greater confidence in the things out there. It's not only in my quiet time with God, which is vital, it becomes my lifeline, but also out there, that what I do between me and Jesus in intimacy impacts my independence or my living in the world for him. Lots of ways to language that. And I just wanted to verbalize that, and thoughts for a second on that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah, it's that, they've done research saying that kids, when they're doing that independent activity, what they're holding in their brains as they're going is this sort of like awareness that, there's even this circle of security that like, I have this home base that I can always return to. And so that's what we experience when we build that secure foundation with God, is we have this home base that we can always return to. And I don't know how many times when I first started learning all of this and working with this, it was like, I'm talking to Geoff and we're having a conversation and we're misattuned and he's not understanding me. And I could just say, I'm just going to take a break for a minute. And then I go and I spend some time receiving God's attunement and understanding of me, because it's always available. And then coming back to the conversation, sort of like, it'd be nice if you could understand where I'm coming from, but I also don't need you to. I'm not desperate for it anymore because I have it with God. And so it allows me to go about the world being a little more misunderstood, a little bit more disconnected when things can't be fixed. And just that awareness of like, I don't have to be unsettled by a disconnection. I can do what I can to repair it, but if it's not repairable, I don't have to be unsettled because, I'm still connected with the one who's always glad to be with me.
Yeah. Good. Really good.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me think of another aspect of this. Our wounds come through relationship. We started out talking about how our experiences as young children forms these attachment patterns and brain pathways. And that's understandable. It makes sense. But our healing, our transformation, our growth, our becoming also will have to include human relationships. I have talked with a number of people who say, well, there's nobody there for me. How can I ever do that? Or I've tried and it doesn't work. They just keep letting me down. Talk for a minute about finding safe enough people, or how our connecting with humans needs to be part of this. You kind of alluded already to this, Cyd, but let's just get explicit for a minute about that.
Well, you've hit the nail on the head, and I think a lot of us we long for churches or places where we can practice this, and then we're disappointed. I think, like you said, we are only, we're wounded in a relationship, and we're only healed in relationships. And so, I think part of what I was talking about for running new experiments is the church community. Is that God has created the church as the embodied context by which we get to practice all these things, and we get to learn about God's love through other people's failures to love us, but also our failures to love them, and us trying to figure out how do we repair these ruptures and continue to move on, as well as God, through the Spirit, inputting love and acceptance, belonging, but also challenge, encourage in the midst of all of that. So I would say, yes, people have let you down. Yes, people will let you down. And that is partly how God set it up, so that then we can learn how to love the way God loves us, and to receive God's love, and then to share God's love. And so it's kind of this inevitable process, but you do need to find an environment that's not abusive and toxic to do that.
Yes.
But there is, like they talk about in the literature, there's only good enough parents. Like parents who are good enough pass on secure attachment. And what we need is good enough churches. There's no perfect church. We need good enough churches is kind of the goal.
And I would just add that if it's an option for you to find a spiritual director, or, even if it's just a one-on-one, even if you're paying somebody to be with you, there's a lot of goodness that can come in your brain retraining just by being in relationship with someone who is going to show up for you, who's going to keep your appointments, who's going to listen well to you. And so, I can't say enough goodness about if you feel like you have no one, that's probably a good indicator that maybe a spiritual director or a coach or, someone like that might be a good first step. And, there's some good resources out there, and, it would be, it just would, that can be a really good beginning, even as you're trying to find other people in your environment who might be willing to be that for you as well.
And I have to second that, what both of you said about good enough churches and a one-on-one spiritual director type of relationship. I believe you guys have put so much of your life and heart and ministry into making exactly that happen. Maybe the last, formal question here. You are both very involved in helping leaders become training trainers, helping ministers become equipped and others become equipped in this area. Just a word or two about what your heart would be for Christian leaders to help make churches good enough, to help the body of Christ be able to grow in the spiritual direction, kind of help that people need. And, there's formal spiritual directors. I think friends in the body of Christ need to be doing some of this for you. Just Talk about that for a minute.
Well, I have a pretty huge vision of, I think what Jesus wants to do with his bride is, make her whole and healthy. And when I say bride, I'm talking about the local church. And so, I have a deep passion for wanting leaders, and I mean, pastors have so many pressures and just so many things on their plate that they're carrying. And pastors live with this sense of no matter what I do, somebody's upset with me. And no matter what I do, the things that I have planned don't ever come to fruition. Right. And so there's just so much pressure that pastors are under, first and foremost. And so I would love, my heart is always to create space for pastors to be able to have that safety where you're not being evaluated or criticized or judged, but you can just be. And it's a place where you can, be open to talk about your own struggles in faith and your own impact in relationships, and to develop a deeper self-awareness of sort of where you find yourself and what your story includes, so that you can be inviting Jesus into that and he can be meeting you there and you can be developing greater security as a leader, so that when you're going out and people are upset with you or things aren't working out, you still have that home base to return to. And so, raising self-awareness for leaders is a very big part of what I want to be doing. And then also just wanting to raise awareness of when you sit across from someone and you don't understand them, it doesn't mean that they're wrong and it doesn't mean that they're broken. It just means that they've developed different strategies than you have. And so if you can actually meet people with that lens of what is it in your life that has caused you to have this kind of strategy, and how is it that I can meet you with, consistency and with care, so that I can meet you with the same kind of compassion that Jesus meets us with. I just think if everybody could have that kind of an experience with a church leader, that would just be incredibly healing for all of us.
Mm. Cyd said the whole thing. That's what we're hoping for in all of our work.
I have been so enriched by talking with the two of you today. Your book, Landscapes of the Soul, How the Science and Spirituality of Attachment Can Move You into Confident Faith, Courage, and Connection. I loved it. I don't want to encourage our listeners to get it. We'll make sure links are in the show notes, or if you're watching under this video. I would also like the two of you to maybe let our listeners know about Embodied Faith and how they might connect with any of the work that you do.
Well, you can find us at embodiedfaith.life. That's our website. And there we have a couple cohorts that we do. One is called Attaching to God, where you can have 6 weeks of sort of exploring this content that's in the book, but doing it in community, and doing practices together. And then I also do one called Rooted, which is a 6-week cohort that's basically learning how to regulate your nervous system so that you can move out of protection and back into connection. And then we do our doctoral program at Western Theological Seminary. And then I'm also running a pilot for an integrative training program right now, which I hope will be offered in a broader way next year. Geoff, am I forgetting anything?
Our book, podcast. I have a Substack that is linked there too. So everything is at embodiedfaith.life.
Thanks for mentioning the podcast. And Cyd, may it be that the pilot you're writing gets spread abroad. I am just so grateful for the two of you. First of all, for who you are and this work, and then for our time today. Just many, many blessings to both of you in your own hearts and in your work. May your tribe increase.
Thank you.
So much.
It was a joy to be with you today.
Do check the links here, folks. Reading their book, Landscapes of the Soul, How the Science and Spirituality of Attachment Can Move You into Confident Faith, Courage, and Connection. It enriched me. It's going to be on my list of favorites for my books this year. And check out the links. Check out their podcast. Check out Embodied Faith, and all the links are under this video. I know that will be a help to you. One of the things that Cyd highlighted near the end of our conversation was the benefit in connecting perhaps one-on-one or in a small, safe group setting. Geoff mentioned that a bit more. I just want to let you know that at Dr. Carroll Ministries, those are some things we have available for you. I do offer individual coaching, which is, I frame this pretty much as spiritual direction. So if that's something you'd be interested in, I'd be happy to explore that, talk about that with you. We also have our small group intensives, where a small group of women or a small group of men come together for a few days in a beautiful setting here in Central Texas at Transformation Place and process your story, the hard places in your story, especially around intimacy and sexuality and relationships, and experience Jesus coming into the middle of your story. Beautiful, beautiful things happen. So I'd be thrilled to talk with you about that also. I want to thank you for being with me on this episode. And now until next time, may God bless you.